At Sunday dinner, my son-in-law set down his fork, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "You're dead weight. We can manage just fine without you." No hesitation, no nervous smile to soften the blow, just those words, dropped in the middle of the table like a stone in still water. The room went silent. My daughter's hand froze halfway to her glass. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. No one moved to correct him. No one spoke up for me. It was as if the sentence had already been agreed upon before I walked into the room. I didn't react right away. Years of swallowing my pride had taught me the value of stillness when you're blindsided. But inside, the words landed with a deep, dull thud, echoing in places I'd thought were long beyond being hurt. He didn't say it in anger. It was worse than that. He said it like a fact. A piece of household math that no longer added up in my favor. My daughter looked down at her plate. My grandson, too young to understand the weight of the words, asked if he could be excused. My wife pressed her napkin into her lap, staring at the tablecloth as if the pattern there could save her from the moment. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed late, fixing his broken tools in the garage, so he could get to work on time the next morning. All the times I'd co-signed papers to give him a chance he wouldn't have gotten alone. All the conversations we'd had over coffee about the kind of future he wanted for the family. I remembered standing next to him on the day he married my daughter, shaking his hand like it meant something sacred. And now, here he was, telling me I was ballast to be cut away so the ship could sail lighter. The rest of the meal went on without me, though I was still in the chair. They talked about a cousin's engagement, about some new restaurant they wanted to try, about things that needed fixing around the house, none of which, apparently, required me. I chewed my food without tasting it, my mind replaying his words again and again until they stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like a verdict. When dessert was served, I excused myself before anyone could light the candles on the pie. No one stopped me as I stepped into the hallway and reached for my coat. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror by the door. Same shoulders, same hands, same man who had built so much of what they were standing on. Now. But the eyes looking back at me were older somehow, not just in years, but in the kind of knowing that comes when you realize you've been erased from your own story. That night, I sat alone in my study long after the rest of the house had gone to bed, the quiet pressing in like a tide. His words didn't just sting. They took up residence, settling deep in my chest. I didn't yet know that one day I would answer him without raising my voice, without so much as pointing a finger. But for now, I just sat there in the dim light, the sentence "you're dead weight" looping in my mind like a cold refrain, one I intended, in time, to rewrite. Friends, let's take a short pause. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? And if this story speaks to you, please subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow our channel. Now, let's continue. That night, the house felt larger than it had in years, as if the walls had pulled back just far enough to let the emptiness stretch and echo. I moved through the rooms without switching on many lights, my footsteps muffled by the carpet, the stillness pressing in with a weight heavier than sound. The voices from dinner were gone now, no clink of cutlery, no hum of conversation, no occasional burst of laughter. Just silence, the kind that doesn't comfort but sits in your chest like an unwelcome tenant. I ended up in my study, not because I had work to do, but because it was the one room in the house that still felt mine. The air carried the faint scent of paper and wood polish, the familiar creak of the chair, as I lowered myself into it, reminding me of the countless evenings I'd spent here planning, reading, thinking. Tonight I simply stared at the desk, without purpose. My hands rested on the worn edges of the armrests, my gaze drifting over the stacks of papers, unopened envelopes, and books whose spines I'd run my fingers over so many times I could trace the letters from memory. It's strange how quickly affection can turn into absence, how love, which once seemed like the most immovable thing in the world, can slide into a polite sort of indifference without anyone naming it. I could almost pinpoint the shift. Fewer phone calls from my daughter, her voice tighter when she did speak. Fewer visits from my son-in-law unless he needed something. Even my grandchildren had started greeting me like a polite acquaintance, their words quick, their eyes already somewhere else. The quiet in the room began to take on a shape, and I realized it wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the lack of presence. No one would knock on my door tonight to tell me about their day. No one would ask for advice or for help moving a piece of furniture. I was still in the house, but it no longer felt like I lived in it. I was more like a tenant in a space owned by the memories of what it used to be. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, remembering the first time I had walked into this home with my daughter and her new husband. They had been full of plans, asking for my thoughts on renovations, on where the garden should go, on how to make it a place where everyone could gather. I'd given them everything I could, my time, my labor, my experience, never thinking I'd one day be treated as though I were in the way. The clock on the wall ticked in steady, deliberate beats, each one marking another second in which I remained unseen. The longer I sat there, the clearer it became that I had been slowly pushed to the edges, not with cruelty, but with a quiet efficiency that left no handprints. You don't have to slam a door to lock someone out. Sometimes you just stop opening it. I didn't yet have the strength to think about proving him wrong, or about changing anything at all. For now, I let the stillness wrap itself around me, not as a comfort, but as a kind of truth I couldn't deny. I was living in a house full of people, and yet I had never felt more alone. I sat there in the dim light, the shadows stretching across the floor like long, unmoving tides, and the past began to press in on me, slow at first, then with the steady weight of a tide that knows exactly how to find every vulnerable place. It came in fragments, each one sharper than the last, each one carrying the taste of something once sweet, but now bitter on the tongue. I remembered the first time my son-in-law came to me, not as the man who had just called me dead weight, but as a young husband with big plans and more ambition than experience. His voice had been unsteady but full of hope as he described the business he wanted to start. He had charts scribbled on scrap paper, ideas spilling out faster than he could catch them. I had listened carefully, seen the gaps in his plan, but also the fire in his eyes. When the bank turned him down, I had written him a check from my own savings, a sum that was no small gesture for me at the time, and told him it wasn't just money, it was a vote of confidence. I never asked for repayment terms. I trusted him to honor what couldn't be written into a contract. There were the nights, too. Long, cold evenings in the garage with the smell of oil and metal hanging in the air, when I helped him fix broken equipment so he could get back to work in the morning. My own back ached, my hands stiff from hours bent over bolts and screws, but I never complained. I told myself it was part of building something together, even if it wasn't my business. And then there were the times when trouble came knocking, and I stepped in without hesitation. I defended him more than once, against creditors, against a supplier who had threatened to sue, even against members of our own extended family who doubted his ability to pull through. I put my name, my reputation on the line for him because I thought that's what family did. I thought that kind of loyalty meant something, that it built a bond you could lean on when life turned hard. Now, sitting here years later, I could still see the moments in vivid detail. Him shaking my hand in gratitude, his voice low, as he promised he'd never forget what I'd done for him. I believed him then. I believed that those promises were like nails driven into solid wood, meant to hold. But I was wrong. They were written in chalk, and somewhere along the line, he had found the rain to wash them away. The bitterness didn't come from the money or the labor I'd given him. It came from the ease with which he had erased it all, as if those years of help were just a footnote he could tear out without damaging the story. He had taken my support, my trust, and built a life on it, and then stood across the table from me and called me dead weight. I leaned forward in my chair, my elbows pressing into the worn wood of the desk, and stared at my own hands in the lamplight. These were the same hands that had signed his first loan guarantee, that had lifted broken machinery onto workbenches, that had shaken his in a pact I thought would last, and now they rested here, empty, as if the only thing left for them to hold was the knowledge that I had been wrong about the man I had once called family. What I didn't know What I couldn't yet see was that these memories, as bitter as they were, would soon stop being the weight that pulled me under and become the very foundation of the quiet justice waiting ahead. But tonight, they were only salt in a wound that had no bandage. Family gatherings became a strange sort of theater, scenes I watched but never entered. I would sit at the table, my plate in front of me, the voices around, blending into a hum that moved over and past me without ever touching. The conversations flowed easily between them. Plans for vacations, talk of renovations, stories about people I didn't know, and places I hadn't been invited to see. Laughter came in bursts, overlapping, a current I could hear but couldn't step into. When eyes swept the table, they passed over me as though I were a chair or a sideboard, something solid but without any role in the plot. There was a time when my voice had weight here. I used to be asked for opinions, for advice, for the steadying word that could turn an argument into a plan. They used to wait for me to speak before deciding things. Now I was just a listener without lines, a prop in the background of their story. Even my attempts to join in, short comments, small questions, would meet polite nods, quick acknowledgments, and then the conversation would veer back into its own orbit, leaving me on the edge again. The cruelest part was that it wasn't done with malice. No one told me outright to stay quiet. They didn't roll their eyes or shove me aside. They simply forgot to include me. Over time, omission becomes its own kind of exile, quieter but no less complete. You stop being left out by accident and start being left out because you've been absent so long in their minds that your absence feels normal. At one dinner, I watched as they discussed a home repair project, a new fence in the backyard. I had built the original fence myself years ago, every post set straight, every board measured and cut by hand. No one mentioned it. No one asked if I knew a good supplier for lumber, or if I still had the tools that might make the job easier. They talked about hiring someone, comparing prices, and I sat there, my mouth closed, the knowledge in my head suddenly useless because no one had asked for it. It was the same with stories. They'd talk about events from years past, and sometimes I was in those stories, though they told them as if I'd been a bystander then, too. My contributions were invisible even in the retelling. I'd wonder if they genuinely didn't remember or if it was simply easier to tell the story without me. I learned to keep my eyes on my plate, to move my fork in slow, measured bites so I didn't have to meet anyone's gaze. It was easier that way, not to see the moment their eyes slid past me, not to feel the sting of that small, constant erasure. I told myself it didn't matter, that these were just dinners, just evenings. But a life is made up of evenings, and when enough of them pass with you sitting in the corner of your own family, you begin to feel less like a person they love and more like a shadow cast by a man they used to know. I didn't yet realize that the same people who had learned to overlook me would soon have no choice but to see me, because the world outside this house would call my name when theirs no longer opened doors. But for now, I sat quietly, letting the role of the silent guest settle deeper into my skin. It started as a passing comment, the kind of thing dropped casually in conversation, meant more as neighborhood chatter than anything else. I was standing at the edge of my driveway one afternoon, the cold air smelling faintly of damp leaves, when Mr. Peters from across the street mentioned it. He was talking about the new coffee shop opening on Main, then shifted to how your son-in-law's been making the rounds, meeting with people, shaking hands, talking up some kind of new venture. I didn't ask for details. I told myself I didn't care, but the words clung to me long after he'd gone back inside. Over the next week, I began to hear it from others in pieces, like fragments of a puzzle I hadn't decided to put together. The woman at the hardware store said she'd seen him in the lumber aisle with a notepad, writing measurements. A man at the post office mentioned he'd overheard him on the phone, saying something about expansion and financing. Even the younger neighbor, the one who's never been much for small talk, casually noted that my son-in-law had been driving around with folders and papers in the passenger seat, documents that looked official. It was strange the way these scraps of information stirred something in me. On the surface, I felt indifferent. let him build whatever empire he thought he could. But beneath that there was a quiet, persistent pull. I had been part of his beginnings once, helping him open doors when he didn't even know where to find them. And now I was hearing about his new plans from the mouths of strangers. There was an irony in that, though it wasn't bitter so much as hollow. At night, in the stillness of my study, I caught myself thinking about the last business we'd spoken of together, the one I'd helped keep afloat when the numbers weren't in his favor. I remembered how he'd sat across from me, speaking of goals and potential, his words careful but hopeful. Now he was making moves without a word in my direction. That silence said more than anything else could. He didn't think I was worth consulting, didn't think I could be of use. One evening, as I was locking up the front door, I saw him drive by. He didn't notice me, or maybe he did and chose not to wave. The car slowed as it passed the corner, and in the fading light, I could see the pale outline of papers on the seat beside him. They caught the last glint of sunset before disappearing into the shadow of the street. Something about that fleeting glimpse lodged itself in my mind, not the papers themselves, but the way they looked like a future already in motion, one I hadn't been invited to witness. I didn't ask my daughter about it. I didn't mention it to anyone. But each time another piece of the story reached me, from the grocery store clerk, from a neighbor's passing remark, it settled quietly into place. And though I didn't know the full picture yet, I began to feel that whatever he was building, whatever he was chasing, would sooner or later brush up against me again. Only this time, I wouldn't be standing there with my hand out, ready to help. This time I would be watching, waiting, letting him come to me, if he had the nerve. It came to me the way most truths do, when you're not looking for them, slipped between two unrelated moments disguised as something ordinary. I was in town, standing in line at the small branch of the bank where I'd kept an account for decades. The kind of place where the tellers still remember your name and ask after your health, where the air smells faintly of paper, polished counters, and the faint tang of ink from stamped documents. I wasn't there for anything important, just to deposit a check and exchange a few polite words. As I stepped up to the counter, the manager, an old acquaintance of mine named Harris, passed by. He greeted me warmly, then paused in that way people do when they're debating whether to say more. His smile stayed, but his tone shifted, low and deliberate, almost confidential. "I see your son-in-law's got big plans again," he said. I didn't understand at first. "Loan application," he added, tapping the side of his head as though to indicate he'd read something I hadn't. "Quite a sum, too. Looks like he's confident this one will go through." I nodded as though it were casual news, but inside a slow current started moving. "Confident," Harris had said. That was the part that stuck. Confidence in business isn't bad, but the kind of confidence that assumes every door will open before you even knock, that's something else. I left the bank with my receipt in my pocket, my mind heavier than when I'd walked in. The rest of the day moved past me in a blur. I ran errands, nodded at familiar faces, but the words kept circling back. I thought about the last time I'd helped him secure financing, how I'd sat beside him in a bank office, answering questions he didn't know how to navigate, translating the cautious language of loan officers into plain terms. He had been nervous then, unsure of his footing. Now he was marching into the same kind of room, convinced he could claim whatever he wanted, without me, without even the courtesy of telling me. That night, I didn't mention it to my daughter. It wasn't the kind of conversation I wanted to have over dinner, with her caught between loyalty to me and loyalty to him. But I kept thinking of that word, confident, rolling it over in my mind until it felt less like a compliment and more like a warning. I pictured him in that bank office, his papers laid out in neat stacks, his voice steady as he described his grand plans. I could almost hear him smoothing over the rough edges, making promises with the easy conviction of a man who has never had to clean up the pieces when those promises fall apart. And somewhere in that picture was the unshakable belief that nothing could stop him, not even the truth of what was on those papers. I didn't know then that his confidence was already cracking at the edges, that the decision he expected to come without a hitch was about to take a turn he hadn't imagined. And when it did, The path would lead directly to my door. Not because he wanted it, but because the people he was dealing with would see something in me that he had long since forgotten. The call came 3 days later, just after lunch, when the house was quiet enough that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. The phone rang, its sound sharp against the stillness. I almost let it go to voicemail, thinking it was another telemarketer or a routine reminder from the clinic. But something in the second ring, steady, insistent, made me pick up. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, carrying that particular formality that bankers seem to master. He introduced himself as a senior officer from the same branch I'd visited earlier in the week. Then came the words that made me sit a little straighter in my chair. "I'd like to invite you in to discuss a matter related to a member of your family, specifically, your son-in-law." He said it as if reading from a prepared line, each word carefully placed. I asked what the matter was, but he didn't give specifics, just that it would be in everyone's best interest to meet in person. That phrase lodged in my mind like a splinter, in everyone's best interest. It wasn't a request you could shrug off. There was a weight to it, the kind of tone that made you understand there was more beneath the surface than they were willing to say over the phone. He offered me 2 appointment times. I chose the earlier one without thinking. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, the dial tone replaced by the steady hum of the quiet house. My first thought was that it had to do with the loan application Harris had hinted at. But the more I considered it, the more I realized this wasn't a courtesy call. They weren't inviting me to witness his success. They were pulling me into a conversation he probably didn't want me to be part of. I thought of how he'd looked at me across the dinner table not long ago, his words sharp and certain. "You're dead weight." The memory settled over me like a heavy coat. If he knew the bank was calling me, I imagined it wouldn't be with gratitude. It would be with the same look of irritation he wore when a plan didn't unfold exactly as he wanted. And yet, here I was, being summoned, not by him, but by the very people he'd gone to for help. That night I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what role I could possibly play in whatever mess he had stepped into. Was my name still on some old agreement? Had he listed me without telling me? The possibilities ranged from mildly inconvenient to deeply entangled. And the truth was, I wouldn't know until I stepped into that office. But one thing had already shifted: the balance between us. He might have believed I had no place in his plans, but someone with authority, thought otherwise. I rose early the next morning, my suit pressed, shoes polished, the way I'd done for business meetings years ago. As I left the house, locking the door behind me, I felt the faint stir of something I hadn't carried in a long time. Not anger, not yet satisfaction, but the quiet sense that I was walking toward a moment where the ground might tilt in my favor again. The bank smelled faintly of polished wood, and the kind of paper that has passed through too many hands. Sunlight poured through the tall front windows, glinting off glass doors, and the metal trim of desks. A young receptionist guided me down a quiet hallway, the sound of our footsteps softened by thick carpet. She stopped at a door marked Loan Department Senior Officer, and opened it with a professional smile. Inside, the office was neat to the point of precision. A large desk stood between me and the man who had called, mid-50s, silvering at the temples, his suit pressed sharp enough to cut. He shook my hand firmly, gestured for me to sit, then closed the folder in front of him, as if to give the conversation his full attention. But I noticed that he kept one hand resting on that folder, like an anchor. He began with pleasantries, how long I'd been a client, the value of trusted relationships between the bank and its long-standing customers. But then his tone shifted, each word gaining a measured weight. "The reason I asked you here," he said, "is that your name appears on a pending loan application as one of the primary guarantors." For a moment the words didn't land. It was as if he'd spoken in another language. Primary guarantor meant not just a signature, it meant responsibility, obligation, exposure. And then the rest of his sentence caught up with me. "Your name appears. Not you signed, not you agreed, appears." He slid the folder toward me, opening it to reveal a stack of documents. My son-in-law's name was printed cleanly across the top of each page, alongside columns of numbers that spoke of ambition with no breaks. And there, in the section marked Guarantor, was my own name, spelled correctly, the letters steady, but written in a hand that was not mine. I leaned closer, scanning the signature line. It was a close imitation, but the slant of the letters was wrong, the spacing too neat. It was the kind of forgery done by someone who believed they were smart enough to pass inspection. The officer didn't say the word forged, not yet, but the implication was clear in the way his eyes held mine. I sat back slowly, my fingers tightening around the arms of the chair. I thought of the dinner table, of his voice saying I was dead weight, and felt the slow burn of something deeper than anger. He had cut me out of his plans only to use my name when it suited him. The arrogance of it was staggering. The officer explained in calm, careful terms that before the bank moved forward, they needed my confirmation, my consent to remain on the application. He was offering me a choice, though I could tell by the pause in his voice that he already suspected what my answer would be. He didn't press me, didn't push, he simply waited. I didn't answer right away. I traced the edge of the paper with my eyes, noting the numbers, the projected returns, the hidden debts tucked into the fine print. It was worse than I imagined. He was building this venture on a foundation of sand, and he was willing to risk my name, my credit, my security to do it. When I finally looked up, I met the officer's gaze and said nothing about anger or betrayal. I simply asked for another meeting, one without my son-in-law present. His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite name, maybe approval, maybe relief. He nodded once, closed the folder, and said, "We can arrange that." As I left the office, the air outside felt colder than it had going in. But under that chill there was a strange, steady warmth, a quiet sense that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking into a situation powerless. That evening, I spread the copies of the loan documents across my desk, the pages fanning out under the lamplight, like a map of a territory I hadn't been invited to enter. The paper was still faintly warm from the copier, the black ink crisp and deliberate. Numbers filled the columns in tidy rows, but the neatness was deceptive. It was the kind of order that hides the rot beneath. I began at the top, scanning the declared assets, the projected revenues, the expense forecasts. At first glance, it was all clean and optimistic, the sort of presentation designed to charm a loan officer into nodding before the pen even hit the paper. But as I moved down the page, the shadows started to show, liabilities that were vaguely worded, totals that didn't reconcile with earlier figures. A line item labeled miscellaneous obligations that was larger than an entire year's projected profit. I leaned closer, tracing the smaller print, clauses tucked between bolder statements, almost daring the reader to ignore them. There it was, debt owed to a private lender with no collateral specified. Repayment subject to renegotiation, a vague phrase that could mean anything from late fees to a lawsuit. I recognized the lender's name, one of those shadowy operations that thrives on the desperation of overconfident businessmen. I'd warned him about outfits like that years ago. Page after page, the picture sharpened into something worse than carelessness. This wasn't just a man with big plans and a thin cushion. This was a man standing in the middle of a storm, pretending the sky was clear. And in the heart of those numbers was the most telling omission. Nowhere in all his glowing projections had he included the true scope of his existing debts. The total, when I added it in my head, was enough to sink any reasonable lender's faith in him. I sat back, the chair creaking under my weight, and stared at the neat little signature space where he had placed my name without permission. He hadn't just risked his own future. He had tried to anchor mine to his sinking ship, and he'd done it with the confidence of someone who believed I'd never see the papers, let alone understand them. It wasn't anger that settled in me then. Anger is quick, hot, and burns itself out. This was colder, heavier, a slow, steady resolve. I thought about the bank officer's face, the way he had chosen his words carefully, as though giving me room to decide what kind of man I wanted to be in this moment. I thought about the way my son-in-law had looked at me across the dinner table, certain that I had no value left to offer. I gathered the papers into a tidy stack, aligning the edges until they were perfectly square. This wasn't just evidence of his recklessness, it was leverage, and for the first time in years I felt the weight shift in my favor. The documents didn't just tell a story about his debts, they told a story about my worth too. Because when the bank looked at these numbers, they hadn't called him to explain them. They had called me. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The documents still stacked neatly on my desk, their edges perfectly aligned, as if that order could contain the mess inside them. I sat for a long time in the dim light, the quiet of the house settling around me like a second skin. There was no rush, no sudden burst of adrenaline, just a steady clarity, the kind that comes when the pieces finally fall into place, and you see the shape of the board you've been playing on all along. I thought about calling my daughter, about letting her know what I'd discovered. But this wasn't a conversation to be filtered through the heat of family ties or the reflexive instinct to defend a spouse. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about facts, about numbers that didn't lie and obligations that couldn't be wished away. And it was about reclaiming the voice I'd been told I no longer had. I picked up the phone and called the bank. The same officer answered, his tone courteous but attentive, as if he'd been expecting me. I told him I was ready to meet again, but this time I wanted it to be with the bank's leadership present, decision-makers, not intermediaries. And I wanted my son-in-law nowhere near the room. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't explain myself, I simply said, I'd like to lay everything out clearly without distractions, just so we all understand the situation. There was a pause on the other end, and then a simple, understood, I'll arrange it. His voice carried a note I hadn't heard before, respect perhaps, or relief, as though he'd been hoping I'd take control. After I hung up, I stayed at my desk, my hand resting on the stack of papers. I thought of the man who had put my name on them without my consent, who had assumed that even if I found out, I would be too passive, too eager to avoid conflict, to do anything about it. The same man who had looked at me across the table weeks earlier and told me I was dead weight. It occurred to me that this meeting, this quiet choice to step into the room without him, was already the first crack in that version of me he had built in his mind. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking to humiliate him. What I wanted was balance restored, the truth laid bare, the roles corrected, the record set straight, and I wanted it done in a way that left no question about who was in control of my name, my reputation, and my future. As the day wore on, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I went about small chores around the house, my movements deliberate, my mind free of the restless pacing that used to follow any family conflict. This time, there was no shouting match, no back and forth. There would be no emotional theater to drown out the facts, just a quiet room, the right people, and the truth lined up in black and white on the table between us. I knew that when the meeting happened, it would be the first time in a long while that I wasn't there as an observer, tolerated in the background. I would be the one speaking, the one answering questions, the one steering the outcome. And whether he ever admitted it or not, my son-in-law would have to live with whatever came of that. Because for once, it wouldn't be his voice the room was listening to. The meeting was set for a Wednesday morning, early enough that the corridors of the bank were still quiet, the air smelling faintly of fresh coffee and polished floors. I arrived a few minutes ahead of schedule, dressed in a suit I hadn't worn in years. It fit differently now, looser at the shoulders, but it carried with it a memory of boardrooms and negotiations where my word once meant something. I stepped through the glass doors and was greeted by the same officer who'd called me. His handshake was firm, his eyes steady, but there was a flicker there, an acknowledgement that today's conversation would matter. He led me down a short hallway to a door marked Chairman. Inside, the room was warm and softly lit, with a wide table that seemed designed to make you feel both at ease and aware of your place. The chairman rose to greet me, his grip strong, his expression neutral but attentive. Around the table sat two other executives, each with their own folder in front of them. They waited until I was seated before opening them, their movements slow and deliberate, as though every page was worth weighing. I began without ceremony. I told them I had reviewed the documents in full, that I understood precisely what was being asked of me as a guarantor, and that I had not, in any form, given my consent to be listed in that role. I kept my tone even, my voice low, but I made sure the words carried. Then I laid the stack of my own marked-up copies on the table, the margins filled with notes in a firm, unshaken hand. They didn't interrupt as I pointed out the gaps, the debts undisclosed, the obligations written in deliberately vague terms, the unrealistic projections dressed up as certainty. I drew their attention to the private lender clause, to the way repayment terms were framed like a magician's flourish, distracting from the fact that there was no safety net at all. I spoke as someone who had once signed contracts, who knew how to read between the lines when the lines were drawn to deceive. When I finished outlining the flaws, I let the silence settle for a moment before leaning back and offering what I had come here to give, a proposal. I told them I was not willing to guarantee my son-in-law's loan, not now, not in any capacity. But I also told them that the bank's interest in the project didn't have to die with that refusal. If they were looking for a stable partner, one with a record of making good on his word, they could work with me directly. I had capital. I had connections. And unlike the man who had dragged my name into this without permission, I understood the cost of overpromising. The chairman's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. One of the executives glanced at the other, a silent exchange passing between them. The air in the room shifted. This was no longer about whether they could approve my son-in-law's loan. It was about whether they even wanted to. I didn't press them for an answer. I simply gathered my papers, slid them back into my folder, and left the offer on the table, literally and figuratively. As I rose to leave, the chairman stood as well, his expression unreadable, but his handshake different this time, firmer, as if to say, "We understand exactly what you've done here." When I stepped back into the cool hallway, the sound of my own footsteps felt sharper, more defined. I had walked into that room carrying nothing but the truth and the weight of my own name. I was walking out knowing that, for the first time in years, both had been heard. The decision arrived in the kind of envelope that makes you sit down before you open it. Heavy paper, embossed crest, a weight that said the contents were not to be skimmed. I slid it carefully with the old brass opener on my desk and unfolded the letter in the afternoon light. The first paragraph was formal and exact, every syllable measured. The bank had completed its due diligence and would not be extending credit on the terms requested by my son-in-law. No flourish, no apology, just the cool finality of institutions when they decide. Beneath that, separated by a narrow band of white space that felt like a held breath, came the pivot. The board appreciated my clarity, my documentation, my candor in the meeting. They would welcome a conversation about a separate facility, a partnership structured around the kind of prudence and steady returns a reputation like mine suggested. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the words settle like dust in a quiet room. Somewhere across town, he would be receiving his own letter. The same crest, the same weight, but an entirely different gravity. A door closing with the soft, irrevocable click that tells you there won't be a hand reaching back through to pull you in. I didn't feel triumphant. What moved through me was slower, deeper, a cooling current that washed away the fever of all those dinners where I had sat invisible. This wasn't revenge, it was alignment, numbers set right, names put back where they belonged. The bank called the next morning to confirm receipt. The chairman's assistant spoke with the polished ease of someone trained to keep her voice level, no matter what she's delivering. Yet there was a warmth threaded through it, the human recognition that carries more weight than any stamped seal. She outlined the contours of what they had in mind, a conservative line tied to tangible assets, a timeline that favored endurance over spectacle, governance clauses that respected what experience learns the hard way. They wanted not just capital, but stewardship, hands that build and then maintain. I listened, pen poised but not moving, the ink of my silence as deliberate as any signature. When the call ended, I walked to the window. The street outside looked unchanged, same cracked stretch of pavement near the curb, same winter bare trees, but it was different to me now. There are days when the architecture of your life shifts so subtly that only you can feel the new angles. This was one of them. For years I'd been present without agency, a figure in the background while other people narrated my worth. Now the perimeter of the room had moved, the center was within reach again, not because I had raised my voice, but because I had returned to the one language a certain kind of arrogance cannot counterfeit. Proof. I thought of him then, the set of his jaw when he believed confidence could substitute for collateral, the casual certainty with which he had put my name where my hand had not gone. Somewhere in his version of events, I was the ballast cut loose. Now the ship had met real water, and it was the weight he'd dismissed that kept the keel straight. I felt no need to call, no appetite for the theater of confrontation. The letter had said more than I ever could. The days that followed unfolded with quiet precision. Meetings scheduled at measured intervals. Drafts exchanged that favored clarity over cleverness. My attorney, long retired from the daily skirmishes of commerce, reviewed the documents with the slow satisfaction of a craftsman returning to good wood. We sanded down the splinters, squared the edges, and left nothing loose enough to be pulled free by wishful thinking. By the time I signed, the paper felt less like a gamble, and more like a plan that could stand under its own weight. Word travels differently when it doesn't need a spotlight. I began to notice small changes in the way familiar faces greeted me around town. The teller's smile had a new steadiness. The manager's nod carried a fraction more deference. Even the hardware clerk asked after a shipment, by date and lot number, a question he would only pose to someone he expects to see again. Respect rarely announces itself. It adjusts the tone of a room by a few degrees and waits for you to notice you're warmer. At home, I kept my own counsel. My daughter asked how my day had gone, and I told her honestly that it had been productive. The rest could come later, and maybe it wouldn't have to come at all. Not every justice needs an audience. Some are complete the moment they align with the truth of who you are. On the first morning of the new arrangement, I woke before dawn and brewed coffee in the dark, the kitchen quiet, the scent rising like a steadying hand. I thought of all the nights I had sat in this same room, wondering when the slope would stop tilting away from me. The answer, it turned out, wasn't in outshouting anyone. It was in placing the facts on a table that remembered which voices had earned the right to be heard. The bank had refused the noise, and in the same motion it had chosen the signal. I folded the bank's letter back into its envelope and slid it into the top drawer of my desk. I didn't keep it for the crest or the language. I kept it because it marked the hinge in the door, quiet, precise, final, where a man dismissed as a burden became, again, the person others call when the numbers must hold. It didn't take long for the news to travel from the bank's polished boardroom to the rough edges of my family's kitchen table. I hadn't planned on telling anyone, not yet, maybe not at all. But money has its own kind of gossip, and it moves faster than truth. By the end of the week, the call came. Not from my daughter, not from anyone who might have spoken with some measure of care, but from him. His voice was sharp from the first breath, every syllable carrying the brittle edge of someone trying to sound in control while the ground tilts under his feet. He didn't ask if it was true. He already knew. He'd gone to the bank to demand an explanation, expecting perhaps that a show of indignation might sway them. Instead, they had shown him the neat final line of their refusal, and then, almost casually, mentioned that a different arrangement was already in progress. An arrangement with me. I could picture the moment it landed on him, the heat rising behind his eyes, the taste of it turning his mouth dry. He had built his confidence on the idea that I was irrelevant, that my name was an ornament he could attach or discard at will. And now that name was the door that had opened without him. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with the slow, deliberate contempt he'd used at the dinner table months before. This was faster, ragged in places, an anger that had started too hot and was already beginning to fray. He called it betrayal. He called it interference. He called me a dozen things meant to push me off balance, but every word only confirmed what I had known from the moment I read the bank's letter. This wasn't about the loan anymore. This was about the shape of the story he'd told himself. and how quickly it was collapsing. I let him speak. The phone pressed against my ear. I walked slowly to the window, watching the wind push at the bare branches outside. There was no satisfaction in hearing him stumble over the pieces of his own outrage, only a kind of sad clarity. He wasn't angry that I had succeeded. He was angry that my success had not required his permission. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked softly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue point for point. I told him only that the bank had made its decision and that I had acted in my own best interest, something he, of all people, should understand. There was a pause then, just long enough for me to imagine the set of his jaw, the tightening around his eyes. He ended the call without goodbye. That night I imagined the conversation he would have with my daughter. I could see the way he would frame it, the way he might leave out the documents he'd signed without my consent, the debts hidden between optimistic numbers. But some truths don't need my defense. They sit quietly in the hands of those who've seen them, and they work their way into the air until they can't be ignored. Around the neighborhood, the news settled differently. A neighbor waved longer than usual. The man at the post office mentioned he'd heard I was back in business. I didn't confirm or deny. I simply accepted the mail and wished him a good day. Reputation doesn't announce itself, it returns, one small acknowledgement at a time. At home, the phone stayed silent for a while. No calls from him, no explanations, just a space where his certainty used to be. I didn't mind the quiet. Some battles are best won in the absence of noise, in the knowledge that the field has already shifted and there's nothing left to fight over. And as I sat at my desk that evening, the bank's envelope in the drawer and the contract drafts neatly stacked beside it, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. The real blow to a man who thrives on control is not being overpowered. It's being made unnecessary. The next family dinner came sooner than I expected. It was one of those obligatory gatherings, someone's birthday, an anniversary, where the calendar decides for you, and absence would raise more questions than presence. I arrived on time, not early, not late, stepping into the same house where so many of our meals had turned into polite performances. The scent of roast and warm bread drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the low murmur of voices in the dining room. When I walked in, conversation thinned like steam on a cold window. It wasn't silence exactly, but the rhythm shifted. Forks paused mid-air, glances darted sideways, and in that brief stillness, I could feel the shape of what everyone already knew. Word had traveled. The details might have been hazy, the numbers misremembered, but the essence was intact. The bank had chosen me. The man who had been labeled dead weight was the one now holding the keel steady. He sat 2 chairs down, angled slightly away, his plate untouched. The brightness he usually wore at these dinners, the practiced smile, the easy talk, was gone. In its place was a careful stillness, as though even moving too quickly might invite a look he couldn't return. I noticed how he kept his eyes on the table, tracing the rim of his glass with one finger. My daughter spoke to him once, something about the roast, and he nodded without lifting his gaze. The others tried to keep the evening normal. My grandson asked about the weather, my niece brought up a school project, someone made a joke about the cake. But there was a new gravity to the room, a quiet acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. These were people who had once sat in the same silence when I'd been diminished at this table, who had kept their eyes on their plates then, too. The difference now was that the silence wasn't at my expense. I didn't speak much, not out of pettiness, but because the moment didn't need my voice. Presence can say more than any declaration, and that night, mine said enough. Between courses, I caught the smallest exchanges, an uncle leaning toward my daughter to murmur something, her nod in reply. My sister passing me the bread with a half-smile she didn't bother to hide. Respect, once gone, doesn't come back with a flourish. It returns quietly, in the weight of a glance, in the way your name is no longer rushed past in conversation. At one point I did look at him, just long enough for our eyes to meet, for him to see there was no triumph there, no gloating, only a steady acknowledgement. I was still here. The room seemed to narrow for him in that instant. He shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, and reached for his fork, though his appetite hadn't returned. When dessert was served, the conversation rose again, lighter this time, but the undercurrent remained. Everyone at that table now understood something unspoken, that the name on the family's stability, the one keeping it afloat in ways they hadn't even known, wasn't his. And perhaps the hardest part for him wasn't that I had proven him wrong. It was that I had done it without needing to prove anything at all. I left before coffee, shaking hands, exchanging polite farewells. As I stepped out into the night, the cool air felt sharper, cleaner, as if the house had exhaled behind me. And in that quiet, I realized the truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can bring to a table is the silence that follows a lie undone. The new sign went up on a Thursday morning, just as the light was spilling gold over the brick facade of the bank. I hadn't been told exactly when it would be installed. The branch manager had only said, with a small, almost conspiratorial smile, that it would be soon. I was passing by on my way to the hardware store when I saw the ladder, the glint of polished brass letters being fixed into place, each one catching the sun in a way that made them seem almost alive. And there it was, my name, centered, level, unmistakable, part of the institution now, not as a customer, not as a debtor, but as a partner. I stopped on the sidewalk, hands in my coat pockets, and simply stood there. The workers paid me no mind. They were focused on their craft, adjusting the alignment, tightening the last bolts. People walked past, some glancing up, a few slowing when they noticed the change. I didn't need them to point, to whisper. The letters themselves did all the speaking that was necessary. They told the story of long years of work that had been written off as useless, of quiet persistence when others believed my chapter was over, of the steady, deliberate turning of a wheel until it finally clicked into place. There was no speech, no ribbon cutting, no public acknowledgement of what had shifted. That suited me. Justice, I had learned, doesn't always arrive in a blaze of noise. Sometimes it appears exactly like this, polished metal catching the morning light, an unspoken record of who truly carries the weight. Anyone who cared to see could read it. And those who didn't care, well, the name would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and every day they walked past. I thought of the family dinner not long ago, of my son-in-law's downcast eyes, of the room's sudden awareness that the ground beneath us all had changed. I hadn't needed to confront him. The bank's decision, the quiet solidity of my position, had already done the work for me. And now, with my name affixed to the very place that had turned him away, the truth had been etched into something harder than any argument: permanence. As the last worker climbed down from the ladder and stepped back to survey his work, I felt no urge to linger for their approval. I had already lived enough years to know that the real weight of recognition is not in the applause, but in the fact that it endures when the crowd has gone home. I turned away, my steps unhurried, the sound of the morning filling the air, car tires on asphalt, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the faint tap of tools being packed away. Life moving forward, as it always does. By the time I reached the end of the block, the sign was out of sight, but I carried it with me, not as a trophy, not as proof to hold up to anyone, but as a quiet seal on a chapter that had started with dismissal and ended with undeniable presence. I would not bring it up at the next family gathering. I wouldn't need to. The sign would be there long after conversations ended, after tempers cooled, after people forgot the dates and the details, because that was the lesson I'd come to understand. The loudest answer to being underestimated is not the shout of victory. It's the work that makes your name impossible to erase. And now, fixed high on the wall of that building, mine would look out over the street for years to come, speaking in a voice steadier than any I could ever muster. I was here. I still am. And I will be.